Grimsdon by Deborah Abella. Chapter 9. Courtesy of Byron P. Snedden. You should have seen her. Xavier scooped up a spoonful of mashed potato. She was amazing. When Raven pushed Griffin to the ground, she went for him. And this guy's a lot bigger. Just wham! There wasn't time for me to even think about rescuing her. Isabella doesn't need rescuing. Griffin jabbed at a piece of broccoli. None of us does. Raven pushed you over, Bea asked quietly. It didn't hurt. Griffin shot a look at Xavier. The wind picked up outside. What happened next? Raffi asked. Raven went on the offensive. Xavier shoved another spoonful of stew into his mouth. He attacked Isabella too? Bea asked. With a sword, but she fought him off with her own scabbard and had him pinned to the floor before he knew what happened. Fly held out her notepad. What did I do? Xavier read. I tried to help, but I was held back by these 4 huge guys and, like Griffy said, Isabella doesn't need rescuing. 4 huge guys? Griffin asked. Gorillas, they were. Xavier polished off the last of his stew. He patted his stomach and sank into his chair. The only thing that would have made the meal perfect would be a large slice of pecan pie with cream. Pecan pie? Raffi said dreamily. With chocolate fudge sauce. Bea nudged him in the ribs and gave him a frown. We're not supposed to do that. Do what? Xavier asked. Mention foods we can't have any more. But I was just thinking I'd have a fudge sauce too. Well, that's too bad, Griffin said through gritted teeth. Fly, Xavier asked. What would you like? Fly sheepishly looked at Griffin before she looked down and began to draw a rich brown chocolate cake with a thick layer of cream in the middle, speckled with strawberries. I love chocolate cake, Bea sighed. Anything else? Xavier teased. Ice cream and custard. Now you're talking. He clapped his hands. Smoked ham. Raffi rubbed his stomach. I know, I'm full, but I could find room for that. This isn't helpful since there's no way we can have any of it, Griffin warned Xavier. Isabella, Xavier ignored him. What would be perfect for you right now? Come on, Isabella, it's fun. Bea jumped to her knees and leant across the table. If you imagine hard enough, you can almost taste it. Raffi licked his lips with a loud slurp. Isabella smiled. A large mango where the juice runs down your arms, no matter how hard you try to stop it. Raffi flopped forward in a dreamy haze. Why didn't I think of that? And for you, Griff, my old mate? Xavier asked. I'm not your mate, and I'm not doing this. I know, Bea exclaimed. Christmas pudding, she turned to Raffi. Do you remember how Mum used to make it with her secret spices? You could smell it all the way down the street. No one else's mum made it as good as she did. Raffi slipped back into his chair, eyes filling with tears. Bea snuggled up and put her arm around him. Griffin shot Xavier a cold, I told you so stare. I bet it was the best, Isabella said. Better than anyone's, Raffi nodded. Fly wrote in her notebook and held it out to Xavier. Why don't I use the aerotrope to leave? He read. I like it here. He threw out his hands. I get to decide everything. No one tells me what to do and when to go to bed. It's all up to me. That part is good, Raffi said. What have you been doing since the floods? Isabella asked. Exploring, scavenging, building the velocraft and the aerotrope, reading. Reading what? Bea asked. Alice in Wonderland, Narnia, The Wizard of Oz. Raffi sat up. We're reading The Wizard of Oz. They're about to enter the Emerald City. Actually, Griffin reads it to us, Bea corrected. He does the voices better than anyone. Griffin's talents just don't stop, do they? Fly finched as 4 loud raps came through the wall. 2 men with wild, rumpled hair and long coats slid into the room through a broken window Xavier had jemmied open. Well, well, well! Tyrone stuck his thumbs into the waist of his oversized trousers, which were held up with a snakeskin belt. Yeah, this looks very cosy. He flicked his fingers at the brim of his cowboy hat so they could see his yellowed smile and dark, lifeless eyes. Mind if we join in? His buckled boots scuffed and jangled as he swaggered across the floor. He lay his hat on the table and leant over the pot of stew. He took a big swipe with a grubby finger and shoved it in his mouth. Fly screwed up her face. Mouse hurried to the table and did the same. That's real good. He picked up a spoon and shoveled in great mouthfuls, hardly stopping to breathe. Tyrone flopped on the chair. So, what have you got for us today, Queen Isabella? Nothing. You're not due until next week. Xavier shrugged. Who are these goons? Goons? Raffi laughed into his hands. Tyrone shot him a silencing look. Watch it, little man. Bea pulled Raffi closer. These gentlemen are Mouse and Tyrone, Isabella said. They live on the lone boat in the harbour. Snedden's men? Xavier asked. You know Snedden? Tall guy, ridiculous hairdo. Thinks he's some kind of lord of the harbour. Tyrone's lips lifted in disgust as he moved in closer. What's your name? Xavier reeled back and held his nose. Xavier Stone, and you ought to do something about that breath. Tyrone stabbed Xavier's chest with his finger. Snedden is the guy who very graciously saves these kids from being turned over to the authorities, he sniggered, before adding, for a fee. You don't pay these guys, do you? We made a deal and it's none of your business, Griffin warned. But there are no authorities, Xavier said. You've heard of the government, I presume? Tyrone protested. Mouse nodded, too busy with his potato and stew to say anything. Xavier laughed. The government gave up any chance of saving Grimsdon years ago. How do you know that? Isabella asked. Xavier was momentarily stumped. I don't know, obviously, but I don't see any more rescue boats or any bit rebuilding. He turned to Tyrone. How exactly does Snedden save these kids? The government stopped sending troops to look for survivors in the first year, then secretly employed bounty hunters to do their work. Each time they found someone, the government used it to prove how they hadn't given up finding the lost. When that's exactly what they'd done. The kid got a new home, the bounty hunters got paid, everyone was happy. Except some of you kids don't want to be found. He patted Fly's head. She pulled away and moved beside Isabella. That's where we come in. Tyrone ran his good hand over his knotted beard. The captain does a deal with the bounty hunters. who agreed to leave these kids alone, and each month they bring us goods for our services. We get what we want, they get left alone. It's called offering protection, Mouse revealed, a jagged-toothed grin. It's called blackmail, Xavier shot back. Tyrone held his arms wide. Does it look like they've been captured to you? Xavier shook his head. There's the occasional thief crazy enough to enter the city looking for riches, but there are no bounty hunters, and you know it. Maybe because they've been paid off, Griffin said with a warning tone. He's smart, that little professor. Tyrone's smile was smug. Mouse wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and burped. Captain thinks it's a very fair deal. He also thinks that flying machine should be part of it, Tyrone added. Xavier sprang to his feet, sending his angel-wing chair smacking to the floor. He slammed his hands onto the table, flattening Tyrone's hat. That flying machine is mine, and I'm not part of any thieving deal you have with these kids. You even think about touching that machine, and I'll come after you, I promise. Tyrone laughed. What are you, 13, 14 years old? Nearly 15, Xavier answered. And what are you going to do to me? It won't just be me. I'll be bringing my friend, Raven. Both men flinched. Tyrone tucked a hand in his pocket. So you do remember him? Xavier's tone had a mischievous tinge. You've had your say, Tyrone, Isabella said. And as today isn't collection day, it's time you left. Xavier lifted the squashed cowboy hat and tried with a few quick tugs to pull it back into shape. Don't forget this. Tyrone snatched his hat with his good hand. The captain won't like what you've had to say. Mouse lifted his bulky weight and lumbered after him. You think it's smart upsetting those guys? Griffin asked after they'd gone. Those two can't even manage to brush their teeth. Xavier picked up his chair and sat heavily. I wouldn't be worried about them. But what about Snedden? Raffi asked. He's over 3 meters tall, wears a patch where he lost his eye in a fight with a shark, and carries 6 different types of knives in his belt. He's so strong, Bee said. He can crush a tin can in his hand. Xavier frowned. I think you've confused Snedden with a character in your books. Why did you mention Raven? Isabella asked. Snedden's men tried to take over the haggle. They caused a bit of damage too, until Raven and the kids made sure they ended up in the river, with Tyrone missing part of a finger as a warning never to come back. He wore a mischievous grin. What if you refuse to pay? We can't do that, Griffin said. But Griff, Xavier threw his hands into the air. We don't owe anybody anything, not after what we've been through. Snedden said if we didn't pay him, he'd destroy us. Destroy you? Xavier laughed. You make it sound like some kind of bad guy film. The trouble with you, Griff, is that you're not willing to do anything you're afraid of. And you just want to be a hero, Griffin shot back. Adults are the reason we're in this mess, which means they don't get to tell us what to do anymore. If I don't want to be on the end of a fight we can't handle, and I don't want to be on the end of a fight we can't handle. But we're smarter than them, so we'd be ready for anything they dished up. It's true, Griffin. Raffi jumped from his chair and held up his fists. We'd outfight them and outsmart them. Bee circled her brother and wrestled him onto the floor. We can let him know that we won't be bossed around anymore. Whiffy wheezed from Bee's headlock. Snedden better watch out if he comes across you two, Xavier laughed. This is serious, Griffin cried. Bee released her brother and they climbed back onto their chairs. Ask Raven about him, Xavier said. He'll tell you Snedden's not as dangerous as you think. There's no point talking to Raven, Griffin said. Everything has been fine making payments to Snedden, so why stop now? What do you think, Isabella? Xavier asked. Everyone turned to her. Maybe we should think about it. Griffin's eyes widened. Why? Xavier's right, Griff. None of this is our fault. Maybe it's time we looked after ourselves. Snedden clenched his hands behind his back and stared out at the flooded waters of Grimsdon. Albert was asleep on his neck. Is it my poor eyesight, or have you returned without the flying machine? Your eyesight, Captain, is top-notch, but, you see, there's this new kid living at the palace. Acted all bossy. Tyrone looked at his squashed hat. He's the one who owns the flying machine, Mouse explained, so he won't part with it. Albert began to stir. Tyrone shifted to the other side of Snedden. Seems to know we have no control over the bounty hunters. Snedden stroked the snake's back. Have I ever told you that one bite from a tiger snake can cause paralysis and even death in as little as 30 minutes? Isn't that extraordinary? Tyrone gulped. Yes, Captain, you had mentioned you wouldn't think an animal this beautiful would be one of the deadliest snakes in the world. Snedden tickled Albert under the chin, and that's the only way to save the victim from that swift and painful death, is a special anti-venom. Snedden reached for a chain around his neck that held a vial of liquid. A gentle lulling of wave pushed against the hull of the sea serpent. Who is he? Snedden asked. Huh? Tyrone had turned deathly pale. The new kid. Who is he? They called him something like... Tyrone screwed up his face. Damien? No, it wasn't that, Mouse said. It was more like Raymond or Fraser. Tyrone pointed at Mouse. Wasn't that it? Snedden closed his eyes and sighed. I've got it, Mouse interrupted with a toothless grin. Xavier. Snedden lowered himself down to the telescope and trained the lens on the palace. He whispered just one word. Xavier.